Picture a hunter-gatherer camp 10,000 years ago. No walls, no private rooms, no clothing in the way most of us picture it today. Dozens of people, living, sleeping, working, and resting within a few feet of each other, day after day, for their entire lives. Everyone sees everyone. Everyone knows everyone's body, the same way they know each other's faces. Now picture something every human body does automatically, without permission, without warning, and without any regard for social timing: an erection. In a modern context, that's a moment of panic. Wrong place, wrong time, deeply embarrassing, something to hide immediately. So here's the question. In a world with zero privacy, where nakedness was simply how life worked, how did ancient humans handle something so involuntary, so visible, and so potentially awkward? Did they panic the way we would? Did they develop tricks to hide it? Or is the entire premise of this question built on a modern assumption that doesn't actually hold up once you look closely at it? Let's start with the most basic fact, and it's one that reframes everything else. For the vast majority of human history, nudity was not sexualized the way it often is in modern Western culture. Anthropologists who study traditional and indigenous societies, from parts of the Amazon to remote Pacific communities to hunter-gatherer groups studied throughout the 20th century, have documented cultures where minimal or no clothing was simply the daily norm. Not a special occasion, not a taboo, just Tuesday. In these settings, the human body wasn't hidden, so it wasn't loaded with the same shame or shock value it carries in cultures built around covering it up. Children grew up seeing adult bodies constantly. Adults saw each other constantly. There was no mystery to reveal, and no boundary being crossed, because the boundary itself hadn't been invented yet. That single fact changes the entire equation. In a culture where nakedness isn't scandalous, an involuntary physical response isn't automatically scandalous either. Modern embarrassment isn't really about the body. It's about violating a social rule tied to concealment. And if there's no rule demanding concealment in the first place, there's nothing to violate. No rule, no crime, no shame. But here's where it gets more interesting, because the deeper question isn't really about nudity. It's about shame itself, and where shame actually comes from in the first place. Researchers who study the psychology and anthropology of shame have found something important. Shame isn't a fixed universal human default, hardwired into us the way fear or hunger is. It's largely a learned response, shaped by the specific rules of the culture a person happens to grow up in. A behavior that triggers intense embarrassment in one society can be a complete non-issue in another, sometimes just a short distance away geographically. Sexual shame specifically has been linked by historians and anthropologists to a mix of factors that built up gradually, over centuries, not overnight. Property and inheritance systems that made paternity important because wealth and land needed a clear line of succession. Religious frameworks that assigned moral weight to bodily functions that had previously carried none. Clothing itself, once it became widespread, which created the very concept of something being covered versus exposed. A distinction that simply doesn't exist in a culture where nobody covers anything. Before those systems existed in a given culture, an erection wasn't a moral event. It was closer to a sneeze or a yawn, something your body does sometimes, for reasons that have nothing to do with intention. Now let's talk about the physiology itself, because this part often gets misunderstood and it's worth slowing down on. An erection is not exclusively a marker of sexual arousal, even though modern culture treats it that way almost automatically. It's an autonomic nervous system response, meaning it happens without conscious control, triggered by a surprisingly wide range of things that have nothing to do with desire. Temperature changes, physical friction from walking, running, or sitting a certain way. Certain stages of sleep, which is why it happens involuntarily overnight for most biological males, regardless of what they were dreaming about or whether they were dreaming at all. Simple nervous system stimulation, with no emotional or sexual component whatsoever. Doctors and researchers today still see this clearly in clinical settings, where erections occur during routine physical exams for purely mechanical nervous system reasons that have nothing to do with arousal in any meaningful sense. Ancient people, living in close communal proximity their entire lives from birth to death, would have observed this pattern constantly, in themselves and in everyone around them, from early childhood onward. It wouldn't have looked mysterious. It wouldn't have looked shocking. It would have looked exactly like what it is. An ordinary, frequent, unremarkable bodily function, no more worth commenting on than someone stretching or clearing their throat. So in many ancient and traditional communal settings, the honest answer to how did they handle it is almost anticlimactic. Largely, they didn't have to handle it at all. There wasn't a social mechanism demanding they hide it, because there wasn't a cultural rule that treated it as shameful in the first place. It happened. People noticed, or more often didn't notice, the same way you don't notice someone else yawning across a room. Life continued around it, uninterrupted. But here's the thing. It would be a mistake to paint this as one universal story where nothing was ever taboo anywhere for all of human history. That's not accurate, and it flattens a much more complicated picture into something too simple to be true. Taboos around bodily exposure absolutely existed in specific ancient and traditional cultures, and they varied enormously from region to region and even within the same region over time. Some societies enforced strict modesty codes tied to status, age, or gender, even while living in otherwise minimally clothed conditions the rest of the time. Certain rituals and ceremonies carried very specific rules about exposure, sometimes far stricter than everyday life, sometimes looser, depending entirely on the context and the meaning attached to that particular ceremony. In some cultures, visible arousal in the wrong ceremonial setting could carry real social consequences, even punishment. Anthropological records show enormous variation from one society to the next, shaped by religion, hierarchy, climate, and local custom, layered on top of each other in ways that resist any single tidy explanation. There was never one single ancient human experience. There were thousands of distinct cultures spread across every continent and every era, each with its own rules, and the honest picture is a patchwork, not a single simple answer. What does hold up across a huge range of these societies, though, is the underlying pattern. The intensity of shame around this specific bodily function tracks closely with how covered a culture's daily clothing norms were, and how sexually restrictive its broader belief system became over time. Cultures that spent more of their history clothed, especially those shaped by religious traditions that treated the body itself as something to be modest about, developed much stronger emotional reactions to visible arousal. Cultures with less daily covering, less religious emphasis on bodily concealment, generally treated it with far less weight if they registered it as significant at all. There's also solid historical evidence outside of ethnography, sitting in plain sight in museums around the world. Ancient art across multiple civilizations, including Greek pottery, certain Roman frescoes, and figures from other ancient cultures, depicted the male body, including states of arousal, in contexts that were decorative, humorous, comedic, or symbolic, rather than scandalous or forbidden. If it were treated the way modern culture often treats it, that kind of imagery simply wouldn't have existed openly in public and domestic spaces the way historians and archaeologists have repeatedly found it. So zooming out, what does this actually tell us? It tells us that embarrassment itself has a history, a timeline, a moment where it started. It's not hardwired into human biology the way the physical response underneath it is. The body's automatic reactions have stayed essentially the same for tens of thousands of years, unchanged by any of this. What's changed dramatically and repeatedly across different cultures and different centuries is the meaning different societies chose to attach to those reactions. Modern discomfort around this topic isn't a universal human constant, even though it can feel that way from the inside. It's a specific cultural inheritance, built up gradually over a few thousand years of clothing, religion, and social structure, layered on top of a body that's been doing exactly the same automatic thing since long before any of those systems ever existed. So the next time this happens to you, or to someone you know, and it lands as an awkward, mortifying moment, it's worth remembering what's actually going on underneath that reaction. Your body hasn't changed in tens of thousands of years. It's running the exact same ancient automatic program it always has. What's changed is everything built up around it, layer after layer, culture after culture. Somewhere back along the human timeline, this wasn't a crisis. It wasn't a joke either. It was just a body doing what bodies do in a world that hadn't yet decided to be embarrassed about. If this changed how you think about where shame actually comes from, drop a comment and let me know.